Question, how can Canada and China begin to normalize relations from here if they should at all? That brings me to my next guest, Irvin Studin. He is the editor-in-chief and publisher of Global Brief magazine, president of the Institute for 21st Century Questions, and today Irvin has an opinion piece published in the South China Morning Post on possible solutions for Canada when it comes to China. And Irvin joins me once again from Toronto tonight. Welcome to you.
Bonsoir, Carol.
Bonsoir. Irvin, you say the relations between Canada and China is a tragedy in the making. What do you mean?
We never really got started. We never knew each other. Canada is created right after China loses the Second Opium War, and China is destabilized after that loss for about 150 years. Now they're back with a vengeance, for good and ill, but largely flourishing economically, politically, administratively, culturally, strategically. And we haven't known that modern China. We're very close to China physically. We're closer to the Chinese than the Australians are. The Australians realize they're in Asia. We don't realize we're quite there yet, and we're already on the wrong foot. We're calling in some quarters of the commentary China an enemy, a deep threat. How can this be? It's just a tragedy in the making. It's largely not of our own making.
Okay, and let's put this in context of this week's developments. As you know, the ambassador to China said the extradition of Meng Wengzhou would not be good. He laid out 3 possible legal outcomes of her case. Today, he said he regretted saying that by doing so, he confused the situation and declared that Canada is a rule of law, is under rule of law. Was he wrong to say what he said?
I think he spoke a partial truth in respect of the politicization of the Meng Wengzhou case, something I said in the South China Morning Post piece today. Canada cannot possibly extradite her. Whatever our internal processes, it's been politicized first and foremost by the prominent comments of the American president, who said he could use Meng in the context of a bilateral trade deal with China. And it was de facto politicized by our own government when we repudiated those statements saying we cannot politicize. Now he's speaking in an impossible position. I have great respect for the ambassador, and I never personalize my comments as applause or critique. He's in an impossible situation. He spoke a partial truth in saying that Canada cannot possibly extradite Meng, whatever the merits of the case facially. The rest, as to whether he is the one who should deliver that message or not, is probably for a higher pay grade within the government to determine. If he was taking it for the team, good on him. If he was speaking out of place, he's in a difficult position. In defense of the ambassador, let me say this. The tragedy in Canada-China relations today is that we started about 5 or 6 years ago saying that we're going to have full country-to-country, equal sovereign nations-to-nations bilateral relations, as is appropriate for 2 major countries like China and Canada. And all of a sudden we're on the wrong foot. Not only are we talking about China as an enemy, but we're playing defense in the sense we're talking about consular cases, all of them tragedies, and Canada should stand up for its own citizens everywhere. But we've lost sight of the original mandate. The ambassador was there to build a bilateral relationship in earnest between 2 major countries in the 21st century. We're talking about micro, we're talking about defense, and we're in hysterics about a country we don't even know anything about.
Well, that's similar to what the former ambassador to China said today, David Mulroney. He said the government should look to its bullpen, transfer McCallum out, and a new ambassador in the spring and summer, not only, Irvin, because of what he said, but because of how the ambassador, the current ambassador, is thinking about what happened to us and where this points Canada as a country. Take a listen.
Countries like Australia and Sweden and the United States certainly are all thinking hard about what they're learning about China under Xi Jinping, and they're prepared to revisit how they engage China. The word from the ambassador seems to be, let's just get back to the status quo ante, to this supposedly good relationship we have with China. He needs to update his thinking. He needs to be pointing us to the future, not to a past that never really existed.
Do you agree with that?
No. I don't know whether Mr. Mulroney, and again, I have great respect for Mr. Mulroney, who was a yeoman in the public service and a great ambassador as well. I'm not sure what thinking there is to correct. We didn't have the correct thinking to begin with. The analog to Australia is completely erroneous. I'm someone who worked in the Australian cabinet department at high levels and watched how they pivoted to Asia. They have much more expertise on China than we do. They have linguistic competence. They had a national Asian languages strategy. They had a prime minister who was a master of Mandarin, who continues to be the best briefer in the West on China. And he doesn't share that brief of China. It's very sophisticated. We need to be less dogmatic, a little more humble, engage full on. And this is where I go back to our last great discussion, Carol. The Prime Minister must meet immediately with Xi Jinping. He missed the opportunity at the G20. I think actually the Chinese didn't meet with us because we didn't have anything to say at that point. We need to have a larger imagination than just the defense and the venomous discussion we've got into with the Chinese. What's our vision for the bilateral relationship over the next 20 years? And more importantly, for the short term, for Canadians who want to go to Asia and China in business and culture, particularly students, can we get a declaration from both leaders publicly that both countries are invested in zero politicization of travel, bilateral on both sides, and we welcome the other side? That's the status quo ante, if I may, that John McCallum was probably thinking about, where China was a good thing for people to explore. We're different people. Let's do great things together.
Okay, these are part of the rules that you've laid out in the South China Post today. Rule number 1, the leader of China and Canada meeting immediately. Under these circumstances, to what end?
Absolutely. I mean, diplomacy is not about meeting with your friends. We keep saying meet with like-minded nations, and unfortunately, Mr. Arwuni was talking about like-minded nations, so-called Sweden, Australia. Diplomacy, leadership is about getting out of your comfort zone. We need to talk to people who think other than us.
Well, China and Canada are way out of their comfort zone now.
Absolutely, absolutely. And that's where we need to speak. And the two leaders understand that. They're there to be leaders, and they're there to protect the interests of their country and bridge the gaps. There are many gaps to be bridged, but it's eminently possible. So they need to meet quickly. They need to meet bilaterally. I think it's a good thing for the Prime Minister electorally, too. And on the world stage, we have a responsibility not to lose 20 or 30 years in our relationship with China, because, frankly, we're alone in this combat with China. We think that we've got much of the world on our side, but they're all interested in their own interests vis-a-vis China, and we're behind the 8 ball.
Well, they somewhat argue, no, we're very interested in how the rule of law goes forward. The Prime Minister has been consistent in his response that our response is grounded in the court's rule of law. In other words, if the court finds there was political interference, fine. If there's merit in this particular situation, it goes forward. End of story, despite the noise.
Yeah, I think, look, the Chinese are good philosophers as well. They've studied us well. They know our system. And in the piece, I do say that I think we have probably the best justice system in the world and the best legal class. These are a lot of friends, colleagues, students. They're professionally trained. We have an excellent judicial system. But where it gets much more complicated than the Prime Minister allows is where the justice system meets international affairs. There is, within rule of law, a great body of prerogatives. Prerogatives under our Constitution allow the Prime Minister, the Foreign Minister, the Cabinet, the Executive to make great judgment calls. And the judgment call we can only make is that we do not extradite Meng because of political interference. Now, we have to get a delicate exit from this, because it cannot be seen that we didn't extradite her because of Chinese pressure. That's not the reason. We didn't extradite her because it was perverted by the American politicization. And by the way, it's not in our interest to be caught in that.
That's a judge to decide. That's for a judge to decide.
No, after it leaves the judicial system, it comes again to the executive, who makes the decision as to whether we extradite, because these are international affairs. So it may be dismissed, as I think it will be within the courts. All the lawyers are taking notes. But even at that point, after that, if it should emerge, we have every interest in good judgment not to allow. However, how do we elegantly exit? Well, we must demand from Xi Jinping full release of any Canadian. I don't even know whether it's just those 2 or 3 Canadians. Any Canadian who has been detained, even on the slightest perception of political retaliation for our detention of Meng. And then we look for a program of renormalization, a 20-year bilateral commission which outlines a bilateral vision between China and Canada on everything, from trade to international institutions to people-to-people relations to the Arctic to science to the environment. We have a lot to win there.
All right. Irvin Studin is the editor-in-chief and publisher of Global Brief magazine and president of the Institute for 21st Century Questions. Irvin, thank you once again for joining me here in Toronto tonight.
Thank you, Carol.